Well, good afternoon, friends, and welcome to yet another fabulous fall publishing lunchtime webinar. I counted them up recently, and this is number 12 for the year, and the year's not even over yet. Who knows what I have coming up in November and December. Stay tuned for that. Who am I? I'm Chris Beytes, editor of GrowerTalks and Green Profit magazines and the e-newsletter Acres Online, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so as we explore the topic, plant disease ID and management in container nurseries. Now, based on today's registration numbers and those of previous webinars, there is no more popular topic for a webinar than pest management. Today we're going to focus specifically on diseases. Certainly, I've witnessed plenty during my days as a greenhouse grower back in Florida, including some powdery mildew on zinnias that had to be seen to be believed. In fact, I should be attending this webinar just from that standpoint, because we're going to talk about powdery mildew on zinnias. But I'm hardly an expert on the topic. Who is? Well, I have him here with us today. He is Dr. Aaron Palmateer, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist at the University of Florida. Aaron, are you there, my friend?
I sure am, Chris. Can you hear me?
You're coming through loud and clear. Now, Aaron, you may be a fellow Gator, go Gators, but you are not in Gainesville. Where are you broadcasting from today?
Yeah, I'm located way down south, just about 30 miles south of Miami, in Homestead, Florida, at the Tropical Research and Education Center.
So I bet you were you and your clients down there, your growers, were pretty happy to see Hurricane Matthew skip South Florida and stay offshore as it coasted up the state. Not that it was any kind of laughing matter. It was a serious deal, but you guys dodged a bullet, as everybody says.
Yeah, we were really fortunate.
That's right. Okay, and as usual, your host is working the controls from high atop the Ball Publishing broadcast studios just west of Chicago, Illinois, which may be the Windy City, but thankfully those winds never reach hurricane force. Now, a few bits of housekeeping. First of all, if you can't hear me right now, well, you can't hear me right now, but you can read this message. This is for anybody right now who can't hear me and they can't figure out why. So far, I've gotten no messages to that effect, so that's a very good sign. But if they can't, they just need to click on the proper little things there, you know, to make it happen, and then listen to it through your speakers or headphones. Certainly, these free webinars wouldn't be free if it weren't thanks to our generous sponsor, in this case, BASF. So thank you, BASF. If you have questions of Aaron as we go along, there's two different areas where you can put them. On the right side of your screen, I think you can see a chat area that you can use, or you can use the Q&A area where Haley has already done a little testing thing. Haley, I can read it fine, so if you have any questions, just type them in there. And we will get to them either as we go along, depending upon the topic, if it's pertinent to what Aaron's talking about, or we'll save them for the end. And then if anything is too technical, I'll share his email address with you as we get to the end so you can correspond directly with Aaron. 24/7, 365, right, Aaron? You're always online.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And if for some reason you can't stay through the whole webinar, or you think it's so fabulous you want to watch it again or share it with your friends, colleagues, boss, underlings, or whoever, it will be archived, as always, at the same place where you signed up, conveniently enough, ballpublishing.com/webinars. And I think that's all my housekeeping. You guys are ready to listen to Aaron talk about disease ID and management. So Aaron, take it away, my friend.
All right, thanks, Chris. And I appreciate the enthusiasm in your voice, because there's not too many people that get excited about plant disease.
Well, I know you academics do. You're very disappointed if you go to a nursery and you don't see some diseases.
We do. We get very excited. But, you know, it's part of my job to not only identify and appreciate plant disease, but to manage. And hopefully today this comes across to be very practical for ornamental producers. You know, based on my location, I do a lot of work with tropical foliage, but we also have bedding plant producers down here, and some woody growers. And so hopefully there'll be some material in this webinar that you benefit from. And with that, we'll get started. First thing I always like to mention when it comes to ornamentals and just the nature of the industry, a lot of the material is produced offshore, and that opens up huge potential for the introduction of plant pathogens. And it's the ornamental industry that's really blamed oftentimes for disease outbreaks, especially those that occur on agronomic crops. They like to blame ornamentals for not only spreading but potentially introducing the pathogen. But this slide here shows Sansevieria being produced in Central America and Guatemala under shade trees. And here, as you can see, I do want to point out these ladies are wearing the correct protective equipment. You can see they have their bare hands in the water. It's my understanding that this happens to be just water, but what these ladies are doing is that they're washing any of the soil off of the plant material, because plant propagated material cannot have soil when it's introduced into the United States. It's got to be just plant material. And so what they're doing is they're preparing the Sansevieria for exporting it to the U.S. You can advance the slide. And here they it's just an example of how the plants are packaged up. And then they're going to be shipped out in that fashion. You can see newspaper lining the pallets. Go ahead and advance the slide. And so ultimately what happens then is this material comes in from offshore, and then we pot it up and we grow it throughout the United States. Florida happens to grow a lot of foliage. Here you can see Sansevieria in production under shade. And again, this is just an example of one type of crop that is originating offshore, and of course that opens up avenue for disease or for the introduction of plant pathogens. And you can advance the slide. And so this chart here, our table, shows 3 different ports where plant material comes in to the continental United States. And you can see Florida, California, and Hawaii. And I chose, those are some of the major ports just geographically located in the U.S. And it's not just that, the numbers are so much higher in Florida, and that's reflective of the amount of plant material that comes through the port of Miami. Miami receives, it changes year to year, but it's around 85 to 90% of all plant material that's imported into the U.S. And these numbers kind of reflect that. And as you can see, when it comes to ornamentals, Costa Rica is a major player, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. So you have Central America, and then you also have Southeast Asia. And China's actually really come on strong, and I think the numbers have risen from China. But the other thing is the number of interceptions. You can see there's a lot going on. And when I looked at the data this comes from the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. A lot of the data is actually heavily weighted towards insects, and so there's but that just goes to show that there's a lot of hidden disease issues, asymptomatic problems, latent infection that potentially can come through the port on this plant material. But huge numbers of plant material coming into the continental United States. And also, I don't have the slide here, but I looked through, it actually falls under Homeland Security, the folks that inspect inspect airplanes for commercial travel and ships and whatnot. And it's amazing how many different pathogens are found on plant material coming in on people into the continental U.S. And you can advance the slide, Chris. And so back to the disease factor on the Sansevieria, this was a huge problem. This is a new disease. Well, it's several years old now, but this is an example of how a new disease started in the U.S. And so we had this major outbreak on a plant that was really very easy to grow and not very susceptible to diseases and low input type of crop. And what happened was this new species of Calotropicum was introduced, and it just it took over, and to the point where it even put some people out of business, or they stopped growing Sansevieria. This particular species was described in Japan, and I believe is only ever reported in Australia. There was a report in the Philippines, and so this was the first time it showed up in the Western Hemisphere. And after we documented this outbreak in South Florida, subsequently we found it in Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica. And so it probably came in from Central America and was introduced into the ornamental trade in Florida.
This is the reason we've got a Sansevieria shortage right now. Is that correct?
Well, very likely, yeah. There's I know several growers that have stopped growing it. There's still some people in the game, but much less these days. So having just talked about how easy it is or how susceptible this industry is to introducing new pathogens. It's also really important that you need to do your homework and make informed decisions, know what diseases you're up against, so you can take a preventative action. This is really important when it comes to disease. I tease the bug people, the entomologists. I say, you see bugs, you spray them, they're dead. When it comes to pathogens, it's a whole other ballgame. These are microscopic organisms. There's periods where you may not see any symptoms. So it's really important that you take note of what you're up against with the crop that you're growing, and take a preventative approach to minimize major outbreaks. Because once you have a disease outbreak, which I'm sure any grower that's on this webinar today knows very well, it's an uphill battle. It's much more difficult to go in and try to cure problems than it is to prevent. And of course, when you talk about disease, I always have to bring up the disease just doesn't happen. The disease triangle, which is your susceptible host, plant, the presence of a pathogen, and of course, and then the environment. The environment really is what drives disease. You have to have favorable conditions for the whole process to occur, and not only in moving the pathogens, but then also in the infection process. And of course, the previous 10 slides, I mentioned how people play a role, because we move these plants and subsequently we move the pathogens. So we're definitely players in the disease process. And of course, the environmental conditions that are most favorable for disease, water is a huge component, and water, of course, is a way of not only introducing pathogens but spreading pathogens and creating favorable conditions for infection. And this slide here shows Ficus benjamina. This happened to be a Phytophthora root rod. It even moved up into the canopy. The picture, or the small picture of that tensiometer there in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that's actually a poinsettia next to that. This guy in this photo wasn't using a tensiometer to measure water, so they were grossly overwatering and creating conditions highly favorable for Phytophthora. And I preach to growers in my area all the time about the use of overhead irrigation, and it goes in one ear and out the other. The bottom line is it's cheap and it's easy to set up, and they also have it for risk potential for freeze, Arctic blasts that may come down into South Florida. for freeze protection. But the bottom line is that overhead irrigation creates, it's the leaf wetness period is greater, and so you're creating greater potential for infection and subsequent disease. And so in an industry where aesthetics and quality is really important, if you can keep water off the leaves, you're going to reduce your disease issues substantially. And this is a great example. I have to laugh because these are containerized palms, and you can't see a container anywhere in this picture because of how crowded this planting is. And the issue here, of course, is the air movement through this canopy is minimal, and also if you get a disease foci, like you get a location where a pathogen's introduced, a couple plants that are sick, it's just going to take off and run through this planting. So huge potential for failure if you set up your plants in this nature. And I'll apologize to the nursery where this photo came from. I won't mention their name, but please accept my apology.
Not to mention the risk of snakes and gators hiding in there, at least in a Florida greenhouse. I wouldn't walk in there.
Absolutely. And so, back to environment and cultural practices, hugely important for production. It's really important that you're providing the right horticultural practices. The fertilizer, your irrigation, your temperature, your lighting, anything to minimize stress, of course, is going to it's going to be better from a disease standpoint. You're going to have less disease if you've got all your horticultural aspects in line, and that's really important. But the environment can also it can only be controlled so much, and so when the ambient environment, the temperature and whatnot changes, sometimes some weird things can happen to plants. And so one of those that's really common on a wide array of plants here in South Florida is edema. And so when you look at the leaf here, that looks like some kind of leaf spot pathogen. And you can go up and you can take your thumbnail or something and try to scrape that off. Like if it were a scale insect, you would be able to scrape it off. In this case, this is actually swollen host tissue. So what's happening here is the cells are swelling up with water, and again, and then the epidermis kind of swells up, looks like some kind of a spot, but in essence, it's all just plant physiology. And you can see a kind of a close-up of some of the collapsed cells in the upper right corner. I decided to show a few different examples of edema because it's often mistaken for some kind of a leaf spot. And also I should mention that some of the opportunistic type organisms will jump on this compromised tissue and really make matters worse. But here you can see, this happens to be Diplodynia or Mandevilla, and you can see the leaves here, the water-soaked areas. This is early stages, and upper right-hand corner there kind of shows you a real nice example of pimple-like, or blister-like lesions of host tissue. And sometimes you may get some reddish or purplish discoloration. That's anthocyanescence in that tissue. And here's an example of hibiscus. This happens to be Presidente, a popular variety of hibiscus. And when I first saw this, I didn't know that it was edema right off the start, but this is a stage of edema. You can see it's even affecting the leaf petiole. It'll affect it'll even get on the stems, all portions of the plant for the most part. And again, it can be easily mistaken for some kind of leaf spot pathogen. So you really need to be careful and know whether or not you have an issue with edema on the host you're growing. I will mention that we see edema under two different conditions. Generally, when the ambient temperature starts to cool down and the roots stay a little bit warmer, it seems that edema starts to show up. Edema can show up under conditions where you're overwatering, and also under high density plantings with low air movement, high humidity. So we see edema sometimes in the middle of the summer on some crops, and then we see it during the winter here in South Florida on others. So it can be tricky to handle. And then another common issue that I see on a lot of the ornamentals that have thicker succulent leaves, and this happens to be an orchid. An example is a condition called mesophyll cell collapse. And you know, there's been some work done to see, you know, what causes mesophyll cell collapse, because it's not caused by a living pathogen. To make a long story short, it's really has to do with changes in day and nighttime temperature. That's what seems to play a role in the development of mesophyll cell collapse. But here you can kind of just see there's no sign or evidence of a fungus there or any kind of leaf spot pathogen. It's just really just compromised, you know, chlorotic sunken host tissue. And here's just another example. This happens to be on a Phalaenopsis. Now, there has been some work done where they've been able to induce mesophyll cell collapse by watering hot leaves with cold water, and so that makes a lot of sense. In South Florida, our water, we primarily are all the producers on well water. Well water here stays anywhere between 72, 76 degrees year round, and so on a hot summer day, you just imagine what the surface of that leaf may be, and if you're watering with cold water, you can definitely compromise those cells. And then, you know, we've also seen it in areas where condensation's dripping off of irrigation pipe in a greenhouse, and you get conditions like this. But again, something that could be easily mistaken for a disease.
Aaron, quick question. Is the example you showed, orchids, they're, you know, thick, fleshy leaves. Is this a syndrome more associated with foliage like that, or could you see it on pretty much anything?
No, actually, mesophyll cell collapse is much more prevalent on thick foliage. Yeah, definitely. Good question. And then, again, this happens to just be another orchid example that I'm picking on, but this happens to be very interesting. This is an Oncidium called Sherry Baby, very popular orchid, and it smells, it's got a wonderful fragrance, beautiful flowers. But one of the issues is that it develops these black spots, and these black spots are not caused by a pathogen. This is just the genetics of that hybrid, and at least the environmental conditions where we have commercial production here, where you know, 9 out of 10 nurseries, I've never seen this plant where it's been free of these spots, but I've been told if you have the right environmental conditions, which maybe more arid conditions, it would be happier. But it seems to just develop this under our environmental conditions. So this is an example of just the genetics of this hybrid and the environment. Another thing that you really would want to do your homework for. And then I can't emphasize enough how important disease identification and diagnostics is. It's really the foundation for any kind of management program. If you don't know what you're dealing with, you're just shooting from the hip. Time, money, big problems. You really need to get an accurate diagnosis so that you can then manage it properly. And oftentimes that's going to require you know, a diagnostic lab, or maybe some of the folks on the webinar today have access to an internal lab, but you really need to get a proper diagnosis. This just kind of shows an example of how symptoms can resemble one another. And on the left, you can see you have yellow, chlorotic, water-soaked lesion, and on the right you have water-soaked chlorotic tissue. But the one on the left is caused by a fungus, and the one on the right is caused by a bacterium. And so if you're using, you know, your copper mancozeb type products for controlling bacteria on Sclerotium rossi, you're not going to do any good. And so you're just wasting time and money to control something that was misdiagnosed. So be really careful about getting a correct diagnosis. And of course, scouting and monitoring, fundamental. I mean, again, preventative control, early detection is really important. And these are just some of the reasons why, you reduce overall plant damage, you improve plant quality, reduces production costs and avoid production delays, subsequently, increase profits. And so now I want to talk about some of the common and what I consider, economically important plant pathogens. And of course, when we talk about common and important, when it comes to plant pathology, we got to include the fungi. Fungi are the major players, and this first group I'm talking about, it happens to be Cercospora. Taxonomically, there's some Cercosporas that are now in Pseudocercospora, but the bottom line is this is a fungus that causes leaf spots on numerous indoor foliage and landscape plants, and also bedding plants and woodies. This just happens to be a list of some of the popular and common ornamentals where we see ficus see Cercospora in South Florida. And it's important to mention that the symptoms vary depending on the affected host. I'm going to show some examples. So this happens to be Cercospora on ligustrum. Big problem in Florida. We see it pretty much year-round, but it really can be difficult to control during the summertime. We have a lot of rain and high humidity contributing to that leaf wetness period. But the one on the left kind of shows a younger ligustrum, earlier stages, but you can see numerous yellow leaf spots there with that reddish, brownish red margin in the center. And then on the right, you see kind of an older infection, larger. Oftentimes those spots will coalesce and affect larger portions of the leaf. And this happens to be Viburnum odoratissimum, and this particular Viburnum is highly susceptible to Cercospora. And you can see in this case you have these circular spots with the kind of the margins are irregular, but you have that pretty defined chlorotic halo around that margin. That's on the upper leaf surface. On the underside, and this is where it's really important from a management standpoint, this Cercospora likes to grow and infect on the underside of the leaf. And so when it comes to fungicide application, you really need to consider that you need to get in contact with the underside of the leaf, especially if you're using a contact fungicide, because if you're spraying the upper side of the leaf, you're not going to be contacting the pathogen, and that can be a big problem, and you may get fail to control the disease. And so when it comes to Cercospora, this is basically a list of actives that are used in Florida for Cercospora. And I just will mention some of the names. That is oxystrobin with the benzovindiflupyr there at the top. That happens to be Mural, a newer fungicide. But I want to mention the FRAC code there. That's the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee code. Most of you probably are aware of these codes, but it's really useful because what that does is it tells you what group the chemistry is in, and it allows you, it's ease of rotating chemistry. So, you're not using something that's a FRAC 11 continuously. You're going to want to mix that up. And I also mentioned that some of these newer fungicides, such as Orchestra, which is the fluxopyroxad with the pyroclostrobin, and Mural, the one I previously mentioned, two actives, and that's really important because that's going to, you're probably getting some synergism there from the standpoint of efficacy and control, but also you're minimizing the likelihood of resistance in the pathogen population. So again, this is just a list: chlorothalonil, contact fungicide. You've got your strobilurins, your biologicals. Cease is really commonly used, and also I'll mention triathlon is another one that's widely used for a number of different diseases when it comes to biologicals. And you have your DMIs, such as your myclobutanil, which would be Eagle or propiconazole, Bannermax. So there's a number of different products that are labeled for Cercospora. And then I want to mention, because BASF was gracious to invite me and host sponsor the webinar, and I think one of the reasons why is because I've done a lot of work with their products, and particularly the Orchestra, which is a newer fungicide that just recently came to market. And so I'm going to show you some examples of how this new chemistry has tested in my efficacy trials. And this happens to be Cercospora leaf spot on ligustrum. And you can see up there the standard. I used a 12-ounce rate of Pageant. We got excellent control. The asterisk there recognizes that the value for disease incidence was statistically or significantly different from the inoculated or the disease-challenged control plants. And so asterisk, first of all, tells you that it's highly effective at controlling the disease. And then the letters, when different, means that they're statistically different. So what we're seeing here is that the 6-ounce rate of Orchestra was not statistically different from my inoculated control plants, but the 8, the 10, and the 12 were. So the 8 and the 10 ounce rate of Orchestra were statistically different, and you can see the 10 ounce rate did just as well as the Pageant at 12 ounces. And let me mention that the incidence, this is the number of leaves that were affected. And this just happens to be the severity, which shows the same trend. And severity, this is the percent of the ligustrum canopy that was affected. So again, you're looking at, in this case with severity, all the rates of Orchestra tested provided good disease control that was statistically different from our inoculated controls. But you really hone in when you get to that 10-ounce rate. We saw excellent control. And so I want to talk about another economically important pathogen, and that's Calototricum, or there's a group of different fungi that are called anthracnose fungi. But when it comes to a lot of the foliage plants, especially, and Calototricum is one of the major players, and it's a very common problem, more so than probably any other pathogen that we see, because it affects a wide number of hosts, and it's a great opportunist. So a lot of times when you have other problems, this fungus moves in and makes matters worse. This is just some examples of what Calototricum looks like on different hosts. So there on the left, we see there may be a stress issue on that orchid on the left, but essentially the Calototricum has moved in on that tissue. And then in the center, that happens to be a Dieffenbachia. In that case, what happened there was they were using a really high pressure for spraying fungicides, and actually you can just imagine this literally like sandblasting the leaf surface, and that just created a great avenue for Calototricum infection, and so it jumped all over some of the damaged spots on the leaf. And then on the right, that's a close-up shot of those sunken anthracnose-like typical lesions that on the Sansevieria. And then just like, essentially you've got the same group of fungicides, for Caltotricum, very similar to what we saw with Cercospora that are effective. These are broad spectrum chemistries. So there's a wide number. I guess my emphasis here is just to make sure you're rotating your frac codes so that you reduce the chance for resistance.
Question, Aaron. John wants to know, and I think he's speaking in fairly general terms, not about the specific disease or diseases you've covered so far. Can any of these fungicides be used as a preventative measure?
Absolutely, all of them.
And maybe we could ask, should you, or do you wait until you see the problem before you start applying the fungicide?
Yeah, you definitely, as a matter of fact, especially with, the Caltotricum, I'll just pick on the Sansevieria that I've been talking about. That one really has to be managed preventatively. Once you have disease, it's better just to remove the symptomatic plants, discard them, and start with clean material, and of course take preventative action with the fungicide.
It does seem to be a little difference between insect control and disease control, is that we're kind of moving away from preventatives on insects, but not so much with diseases. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so don't forget that.
And so this happens to be an efficacy trial that was funded by the IR4, and you can see we've got a number of different products, Compass being trifloxystrobin, Xeritol being that's a peroxytic acid and a hydrogen dioxide product, Medallion's fludioxonil, Disarm would be fluoxystrobin. Proud 3 happens to be a thyme oil product that was put in the IR4 for testing, and then the Palladium is cyprodionil with fludioxonil, and of course Orchestra, which is the fluxapyroxad with the pyraclostrobin. Bottom line here is you look at the disease incidence, Compass, Disarm, and actually the thyme oil, the Proud 3, we had, and Orchestra, we had significant disease control. And you can just notice that 8 fluid ounce rate of Orchestra there, we had 0 incidence of this would be number of spots of anthracnose lesions. And then here's the severity, and again, the same trend, but Orchestra did excellent in this trial. And so this is just an example of what our inoculated or disease challenge, the controls look like. So these received no chemical. We sprayed the pathogen, the inoculum of the pathogen, and this is what happened. And this is what it looks like when we treated with foliar applications of Disarm. Again, this is fluoxystrobin at an 8 ounce rate. And here you can see Orchestra at an 8 ounce rate, pretty much remarkable. There's no lesions, very clean plants. And then here's an example of what those look like in comparison to the untreated inoculated control. So let me move on. I want to mention about Cylindropladium or Calinectria. Cylindropladium is, again, that's the asexual state, and then the perfect state or the sexual state would be Calinectria. So you may see either one of those names. Bottom line is root rots, basal stem rots, petiole rots, and I also want to mention we're seeing a lot of leaf spot problems with Cylindropladium Calinectria. Spreads very readily in irrigation water. Soil compaction, wet conditions are highly favorable. And of course, there's several species that are prevalent among ornamental plants. And so this is just an example. Spathiphyllum is a very popular plant grown in my area. And in this case, it causes a root and you know, what looks like stems, but they're petiole to rot, and the plant collapses. Big problem when you have susceptible varieties with Spathiphyllum and Cylindropladium. And I want to mention that a lot of our palms, for those of you who do grow palms, be on the lookout for Calinectria. We see it on Majesties, we see it on cat palms. It's very, very common. We've had, over the last 2 years, major outbreaks in production, and you can kind of see that you get that dark brown margin where the center of the tissue is much lighter. But really a neat, I mean, for a plant pathologist, this was a kind of a fun one to work with and something new. It's exciting. The good thing is, again, you've got fungicides that are effective for controlling Cylindropladium. And this is just a list of things. Again, these are actives that would be labeled for use in Florida.
Got a quick question from Colleen. I don't think you know anybody named Colleen. Aaron showed several different species of pronounce that one for me.
Calotoptricum?
Yes, that's the one. Have you seen differences in fungicide efficacy depending upon the species?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, so I've worked just because of the, I guess, the huge impact of it coming in on Sansevieria. I've done most of my work with that model. I will say we did look at Gliosporioides, different species of Calotoptricum than the one that affects Sansevieria. And this was back before I did any work with Orchestra, but I did have a trial with Pageant, and it looked really good. So I've got two species of Calotoptricum where I've had great efficacy. But again, you know, I can't speak for some of the other species, and then of course there's other fungi in that anthracnose group. So this would be something that you would have to really keep a close eye on. But I would suspect with Calotoptricum you're going to get good control.
Calotoptricum. I've got to practice that. Use it in a sentence.
And so, you know, this slide here kind of just shows you that fungicides do work. You can clearly see differences between the inoculated controls and the treated plants. And what I'm showing here is that, you know, fludioxonil medallion's been an excellent chemistry for controlling Cylindropladium. Pageant has done really well in my trials, as well as Palladium. And so what you have here is just a good example of where you could get a rotation between, you know, fludioxonil, which is in one frac group, versus a strobilurin, such as Pageant, and another. And then Palladium has two active ingredients. So you can rotate with the Pageant or the Palladium, or the Pageant and the Medallion would be a really nice disease control program for Cylindropladium. And here's just another trial where we looked at some of the standards, and then again, this is one where I'm looking at that new chemistry Orchestra, and we're seeing, you know, if there's any kind of a rate response. We looked at a 4, a 6, and an 8 fluid ounce rate. And what's interesting here is that we pretty much from the percentage affected was about the same between the 8 and 4 ounce rate, but all three rates were effective. So that didn't come out real clean, like you would expect to see greater control at a higher rate. But again, that kind of tells us we're honing in on that area that's good for controlling the disease. And let me move on to downy mildews. I'm sure most of you on the webinar are familiar with downy mildews. There's been just a tremendous you know, impact from downy mildew on some bedding crops. We also see downy on woodies. These are major pathogens. And this is just an example of downy on a woody. This happens to be viburnum. This is Viburnum odoratissimum again, and you can just see this will cause extensive defoliation and dieback. And this one is used widely for hedgerows in Florida, and also in other areas of Southeast United States, and it can be a big problem. And typical downy mildew, I like to call it bronzing on the upper leaf surface, but you definitely get some discoloration on the upper leaf surface. And then you go to the underside of the leaf, like I showed you earlier with the cercospora, you'll find the evidence of the pathogen there. You can see the downy growth of the pathogen. So again, this is going to be another one that would be important. That you got to get really good coverage, preventative control for sure. This is a table that comes from a fact sheet on viburnum affecting, downy mildew affecting viburnum, and a list of these are fungicides that are used. You can see here they're labeled for use in Florida, and you can shows there whether it's nursery, landscape, or greenhouse. But what this shows or illustrates is just a number of different chemistries. The good thing is these fungal-like pathogens, such as the downy mildews, Phytophthora, Pythium, there's a number of really good products out there, and there's a lot of different chemistry, so they can be managed. If economics is of course it has to be cost effective, but they can definitely be managed if resistance is not available.
Aaron, while you've got this chart up, we've got a question from Matthew, not the hurricane, but a grower, I guess. He asked, these days, with so much focus on biologicals and materials with lower toxicity, which of those types of fungicides would you highlight? So I don't know if any of these that you've listed would fit in that category, or as we go along.
Yeah, so in the case with when it comes to downy mildew, there's another, and it's not in this presentation, but in the fact sheet, table 2 actually does, or at the bottom of this table, it does talk about some of the biologicals. Downy mildew is one where I've had very poor success or limited success at managing with biologicals. That's not to say it can't be done. It's just my experience, and so I really focus on conventional chemistry. But in terms of products, biologicals that are available, cease millstop, there's been a lot of work done. I've heard of success stories of using cease and millstop with downy mildew on basil. And of course, there's also another bacillus, triathlon, which is a different species of bacillus, another biological that can be used in a program for disease control.
And speaking beyond just downy mildew, so maybe as you go along, you can
keep
that in mind.
Sure. Good question. And so here's a trial where we looked at severity of downy mildew in patients, and of course everybody's familiar with downy mildew on guardian in patients, but this is one where we're looking at the orchestra, different rates of orchestra, and I want to mention that I look at these. Orchestra being a broad spectrum fungicide, Pageant being a broad spectrum fungicide, I look at them as good rotation partners for a downy mildew program. But really, you have products that are specifically labeled or active against downy mildew pathogens or oomycetes. Again, your Phytophthora, your downy mildew, your Pythium, and so these make great rotation partners. And I should point out that catamaran, that's a new one there. That happens to be this comes off of a research trial, but that happens to be chlorothalonil and potassium phosphite. And so we've seen the phosphonate groups very effective, and chlorothalonil by itself can be good in a rotation program. So that combination did really well with that product. And then, of course, we've got a stature pageant rotation. We've got the Protect being Mancozeb rotated with pageant. It was interesting in that we got better control when we started with the pageant versus the Mancozeb. And here's just another example of the severity. And off to the right there, I want to point out, you can see the differences between, you know, products that are effective versus those that aren't working so well just in the flowers in these beds. And then the numbers here in the severity slide show you the number of days that there was no evidence of sporulation on the plant canopy. And I want to mention, because I've a newer fungicide that's come out recently called Segovis. This is a product, one of those that's more specific for downy mildew and the Oomycetes pathogens. Very effective against downy mildew and Phytophthora in my trials. And here we're looking at foliar sprays at 1.2 fluid ounces versus a drench, and then a higher spray at 2.4 fluid ounces versus a soil drench. What I'm seeing, and you can see it much more in the next slide, you can go ahead and switch slides there, is that you can see it in the color. It seems that the drench applications have been just phenomenal. And notice that this is 12 weeks after the last application. So this stuff has tremendous residual. So it's something really exciting that's new for this group of pathogens, for the Phytophthora, downy mildew pathogens.
Aaron, you think this would work in the landscape, not just in the production setting?
Absolutely. There should be no reason why it wouldn't work in a landscape. And so Fusarium is another one of these that is very common. Often it may be misdiagnosed because it's such a common fungus. It's really important to have a lab confirm that you're dealing with a bona fide Fusarium disease, because Fusarium oftentimes can be secondary to other problems. So you've got root rots, basal stem rots, leaf spots, vascular wilts are some of the major problems with Fusarium. And this is just an example where you can kind of see, you get defoliation, you get chlorosis, stunting, and then here at the root mass there, you can see some of that fuzzy white growth that happens to be Fusarium. And, you know, Fusarium could have been one of the big problems with this pathogen. It could have came in a substrate and it's jumped on the roots. And then another example that happens to be Fusarium wilt. This is a case where it's going to be fatal. Fusarium wilt diseases are really difficult to manage. And in this case, you can see that the water is the same in this, and this happens to be hibiscus. But the one on the right has the infection with Fusarium, and the one on the left is healthy. And then Fusarium can cause leaf spots. It can also be very opportunistic, like the Calototricum in some cases, that jumps on some stressed and compromised tissue. We see cases where Fusarium is associated with transportation, where plants may not be properly contained, or maybe cases where if it's coming by air and it gets rerouted and gets stuck somewhere for a while, you may get a significant outbreak of Fusarium. But if plants aren't properly put into the shipping containers or put into whatever kind of transportation means that necessary to move them properly, there can be issues with Fusarium. And Fusarium, one of the things you'll notice if you look closely, a lot of the same chemistry that's labeled for your Cylindropladium calinectria, we see that's also effective against Fusarium. I do want to mention that with chlorothalonil, and I had a discussion with Ann Chase about this because she saw this long before I did. But you have issues with chlorothalonil. Oftentimes, you don't want to you don't want to treat or drench roots. You know, the chlorothalonil is listed there more for the foliar issues, the leaf spots, and we've seen some really good control with chlorothalonil with the Calyndectria on palms. And then I also want to mention that with Fusarium, this is, you know, Matt's question about the bacteria, or excuse me, biologicals and downy mildew. When it comes to something like Fusarium, this is where I get more excited with biologicals, because there's, you know, biologicals, if you get a good program going and you can have great success with reducing problems with both Cylindrocladium and Fusarium. We recently, and I apologize, I should have mentioned this when I was talking about Cylindrocladium, but we recently did a trial where we had some really good control of Cylindrocladium on Spathiphyllum with both with CEF and with triathlon BA. So exciting, and again, it's a matter of finding the right use for the biologicals. But biologicals and with Fusarium would definitely be one to consider. Phytophthora, you can't really talk about disease without mentioning Phytophthora. This is an infamous pathogen in that it's caused a lot of problems across the board, but it's hugely important in ornamentals, Phytophthora nicotiana being one of the major players. But there's several different species out there that cause root and stem rots, but then also they can go foliar under the right conditions and get up and cause blights and rots of the canopy. One of the things that often happens with the root rot phase is you start to see just kind of a general decline. You know, the plant can look a little unthrifty, drooping, chlorotic, and then of course you examine the roots, and there you can see that dark brownish black discoloration due to root rot. And the other thing that Phytophthora does, I mentioned it can get up into the stems or up into the crown, the foliage. One thing that's generally the case with Phytophthora is that it turns the tissue dark brown or black. Often can be water soaked, rotten in texture. This is the case here where you can see that black. They call this, on orchids they actually call this black rot. And then the foliar stage, we get tremendous outbreaks of foliar Phytophthora, especially during the summertime. But when you have an issue with this, it can be really difficult to manage. One thing I've noticed over the years is that it can turn on and off like a light switch. We see outbreaks that come on and then they quit as fast as they came on. But it's a matter of knowing the right conditions and taking that preventative approach to controlling the disease. And I mentioned already with the downy mildew on viburnum, again, there's a wide number of active ingredients that are labeled for use on downy mildew and Phytophthora. And powdery mildew, one thing about powdery mildew is that there's a whole lot of them out there. You can't really distinguish them based on the symptoms. The powdery mildew is a powdery mildew. They typically do not kill, but they definitely can render plants to be unmarketable. This happens to be a powdery mildew trial that I did on zinnias. Zinnia has been a great host for me to do powdery mildews. You can see here we looked at disease incidence and severity, and it was really nice to see that, of course, my standards, the Banner Max, the propiconazole, the Eagle, which is myclobutanil, we had zero disease, but then we had some biopesticides in there. We had the Regalia, which got really good disease control at a 64 fluid ounce rate. We looked at 2 different species of bacillus in this trial, and as you can see, again, because the letters are different there, that indicates a statistical significantly differences. So you have control, from a disease incidence standpoint, from the inoculated controls, everything was statistically significant. And this happens to be another orchestra trial. The bottom line here is that orchestra was excellent against powdery mildew. We looked at 3 different rates and used that 12-ounce rate of Paget as a standard, and got great control even at the 6 fluid ounce rate. This is just the severity. So the percentage of the plant canopy affected, but again, you see the same response. And this is just kind of what it looks like. So this is actually the 6 fluid ounce rate of orchestra. And you can see the powdery mildew on the untreated controls on the left. I will mention that, I'm not a good horticulturist. Some people may be laughing at how pathetic of a zinnia that we grow here in my program. But the one on the right, there's no sign or indication of a fungal or of powdery mildew. That may just be general plant stress.
You have bigger problems with just powdery mildew.
Oh yeah,
on your crop.
Yeah, absolutely. Rhizoctonia is another major player. This is a fungus that has a very wide host range, can attack all portions of the plant, but again, this is more common on the roots and the lower stem. But we do see this again. We do see, just like Phytophthora, we do see it go up into the canopy. This is just an example. This happened to be my impatiens downy mildew trials. Got infected with Rhizoctonia, and you can see just the crown there, the plant collapse. You get up there real close and you look, you can see some of the mycelium of the Rhizoctonia, but again, causing the roots, the stems to rot. And this is an example again on a woody of a root and stem rot. You can't really distinguish this rot from Phytophthora other than if the sign of the fungus is there, because the mycelium of Rhizoctonia is very easy to identify. It's much more thicker than something like Phytophthora. And here you can actually see that's actually the fungus, the sign of the fungus Rhizoctonia growing on root tissue. And I promised I'd show a foliar phase of Rhizoctonia. This is a Boston fern. If you look real close on the upper right-hand corner there, that's not like a spider web. That's actually the hyphae of the Rhizoctonia on that brown tissue there. So gets up into the canopy, especially under hot, humid conditions, and can be a real problem. And so again, the good thing is we've got some great chemistry out there. I will mention that the orchestra has that Frac 7 group, and I've been really impressed with that class of chemistry. Like the flutalanyl there, Frac 7 is an outstanding product, or outstanding active for controlling things like Rhizoctonia and closely related pathogens, like Sclerotium ralphsii is another one this is a very good active for those pathogens, and so it makes good sense that fluxapyroxad, that Frac 7 is going to play a role. And so we're currently evaluating orchestra for efficacy against Rhizoctonia. And of course, rust. There's a bunch of rust that affect ornamentals across the board, kind of like the powdery mildews. They are always recurring issues. When the temperature and relative humidity are favorable, we get outbreaks of rust. And so, you know, just like some of the other game-changing diseases like downy mildew, with rust, if you don't have host resistance, you're going to have to use chemistry to control this type of pathogen. And just to show you some examples, you know, one thing it's really important to ensure that you're dealing with the rust, because rust can really throw you for a loop. And the symptoms on the upper leaf surface oftentimes can occur angular and sometimes bacterial-like or cercospora-like. But you really need to go to the underside of the leaf. And here you can kind of see the rust pustules. But you would want to confirm, if you have access to a microscope or a lab, just to confirm that what you're dealing with is a rust. And most for the good thing is that most of the rust have been well described. Of course, there's some out there that there's some work to be done, but oftentimes you can do a quick search on the host and verify that you're dealing with a rust pathogen, or that it's susceptible, I should say. And you know, rust, when you get high numbers of rust, you often just don't see it on the leaves, and this happens to be a canna lily, and man, cannas can get hammered with rust, and you know, the pustules, the spores, they get into the leaf axils, they get into the stem, they get into the nooks and crannies of the plant, and it can be very challenging to control rust on canna lilies. And a good thing, we do have a fair amount of chemistry that's labeled for rust. I mean, the strobilurins, that FRAC 11, great products for rust. And so it's exciting that the Orchestra and the Mural, the newer chemistries, have that group 11. And then we also have, you know, the DMIs, you know, your metconazole, myclobutanil, propiconazole, an excellent rotation for rust control. And this happens to be another trial where we, again, looking at the Orchestra and how it controls. This happens to be rust on plumeria or frangipani. This is the plant that they make the Hawaiian leis from. Very popular in Florida, and I know also we ship a lot of it to Texas. So, but this particular plant gets a coleosporium rust and very susceptible. Most varieties very susceptible, and you can see here we got a really nice rate response. The 4-ounce rate was even effective, but then when you get up to the 8-ounce rate, we got really good control. And we also have, I've mentioned the Paget, but then the Strike Plus, that's trifloxystrobin with the tridimethon. And then your Myclotech is actually myclobutanil. Trinity is triticonazole, and then the Compass is trifloxystrobin. So all those, the asterisks indicate that all those products provided statistically significant control. And this is just an example looking at the 6 fluid ounce rate of Orchestra. And again, this is a preventative application where we're looking at in comparison to the controls. And so you got your controls, the underside of the leaf, and these are leaves that were on the tree. And so we tried to kind of block the sun with paper there, but you can see the rust pustules, you know, as you increase in time versus the 6 fluid ounce intrinsic rate there at the bottom. You know, you don't have any rust pustules. With inoculation, I should mention it was 324, and then so you're 15 days out and still rust free. So this Orchestra, as you saw on the previous slides, is an excellent product for rust. In this case, this is coleosporium rust. And so this is actually one of one of my final slides. What this shows is a table where it shows a summary of the work that's been done with Orchestra, and here you've got 16 different pathogens, 19 different hosts, and kind of a results on how the trials went. And as you can see, what we're looking at is just another great product, broad spectrum control. Very exciting to have another tool in the toolbox for ornamental producers. I thought I'd end with a flowering, with some orchids grown here not too far from the research center.
And with no diseases on them. I know you're disappointed about that. we have a couple of questions for you, Aaron. We covered most of them along the way, but Julie wants to know the lifespan of pathogens on surfaces, such as cutting tools, hoses, tables.
That's a very good question. It depends, of course, on the pathogen. Some of these fungi produce structures that are very resilient. And so can stick around for quite some time. But most of your commercial disinfectants, Green Shield would be an example, a quaternary ammonium product. You're going to just need to follow the manufacturer's label based on how you want to handle the cleaning of the tools. We've got a fact sheet. I'd be happy to send you a copy of disinfectants that we've looked at in time, over time for a number of different pathogens. But that's going to it's going to depend on the pathogen and also on the active ingredient in that disinfectant.
Shouldn't you probably assume that if you haven't just disinfected those surfaces that they do have a disease, and make sure you do disinfect them before you put them into production?
Yeah, good point, Chris. Yeah, you definitely want to use clean, disease-free tools from the start. No question. The other thing is with tools. Another nice thing is heat. You can flame tools. Heat is a really good. It'll kill a number of different pathogens, denature viruses and whatnot also.
Just don't burn down your greenhouse.
Yes, that's
Stephen,
right.
Although that would take care of the disease problems. Stephen wants to know, let's say he says, I get fusarium problems with dianthus. However, I have all the necessary measures in place from day one. He follows all your recommendations, in other words. Could this be a supplier issue?
Yeah, it could be. I don't. I mean,
take your word and take it right to the
There's always potential, but
How would you know?
Yeah, see, that's going to be tricky. Because you just don't. With fusarium, there's so many avenues for that fungus to be introduced. Dianthus, I've done trials with fungicides. I've done trials on dianthus with fusarium, and big problems, and it could very well come from the supplier, but it also you need to make sure you don't have a substrate that you're using that could be a source of the fusarium. Also, your containers, that they're properly that they're either new or properly disinfected. Water sources could potentially be a source as well if you're recycling water.
Gotcha. Okay, Lewis wants to know, what's the REI on Orchestra, which you've spoken highly of?
Oh, that's a really good question.
He's looking it up. I hear him opening a drawer.
Just a second.
Checking the label.
Yeah, it's hang on here.
He can pronounce all those crazy names. He doesn't know the REI offhand. So you can't know it all, folks. Aaron can only keep so much in that.
Yeah, we. No, it's just my. So it's 12. It's 12 hours.
I was just going to say, Michelle just bailed you out. She said 12 hours.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No problem. And then lastly, Emily wants to know, and Louis says thank you. Emily wants to know, how effective would you say good old-fashioned rubbing alcohol is compared to other commercial disinfectants when it comes to pathogen control?
Yeah, these are great questions. So rubbing alcohol, actually, we've done some work looking at rubbing alcohol. It is effective. Depending on, like, we've looked at cleaning, pruning tools with rubbing alcohol. Again, the problem is if it's not labeled for use, you kind of just have to do it under your own, under your own rules. Yeah, definitely has efficacy for controlling pathogens. I can't speak for all pathogens, and as a matter of fact, there could even be some viruses out there where it wouldn't be so good. But from some of the leaf spot pathogens, we've seen good control.
All right. Well, Paul has a question that I'm going to refer him to your email address. He can communicate that one with you in private, and you can go back and forth on that one. It's pretty complicated, but you'll enjoy that. But that's pretty much it. So if you have more questions, like Paul does, burning questions, you can email Aaron at ajp@ufl.edu. Again, 24/7. Operators are standing by. They'll help you out. Including that last question that just came in, Angel. He'll help you. I know a lot of these tables went by really fast, especially those chemical recommendations. If you want to go back and relive this enlightening hour and 15 minutes or so, you can do that at our archive. It'll be at ballpublishing.com/webinars. I'm going to give it to Jen Zerko right away, so maybe within the hour it should be up and ready to go. Share it with your coworkers who came in late. And of course, another shout out to our sponsor, BASF, for making this webinar possible. So for Aaron and all of the Florida Gators, go Gators, for the folks at BASF, and for all my peeps at Ball Publishing, this is Chris Beytes saying, so long, everybody.